Greetings. I am Dr. Mark Winton from the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, Florida, here in the United States. And I'd like to go ahead and get right into talking a little bit about theory that helps us explain protests, massacres, genocide, but was originally developed by David Olson and his colleagues to focus on enhancing marital and couples relationships, and it's based on the Circumplex model. I'm borrowing Professor Olson's and his colleagues' work on the Circumplex model and applying it in this case to protests. The Circumplex model has three main areas of emphasis: cohesion, flexibility, and communication levels. And one can be balanced, or a family can be balanced in these areas, or they can be unbalanced and they can be way off the charts if we were to map a particular family. So using Olson's work and also relying on Winton and Umu's work on the Rwandan and the Bosnian genocides, we look at the corners that can be problematic in protests, in genocides, in massacres, in dysfunctional, problematic families, for example. Enmesh cohesion is when there's excessive emotional closeness. Groups are too close, and there's also high dependence in this scenario and on each other, and there's punishment when people express dissent from the group. And there's also a very strict decision-making process and a very strong connection and identification. We refer to that as a meshed cohesion. People are too close. In contrast, disengaged cohesion is when there's a lot of independence among the groups and there's failure to demonstrate loyalty or attachment, and there's usually no negative consequences for failing to follow leaders. So you kind of have this continuum of a meshed cohesion on one hand and disengaged cohesion on the other, the two extremes. Either extreme is problematic, with the middle being more balanced and more healthy. On the other end of the continuum, if you want to think of that intersecting, is flexibility. And you could have rigid flexibility, which is authoritarian leadership styles, strict code of conduct, rigid rules and regulations that are enforced, and the inability to change and make changes appropriate to the changing environment. In contrast, chaotic flexibility is where there's minimal control over others and leadership styles change very rapidly, and social control is basically very loose, or the rules are not enforced or not even developed. A lot of disorganization and what we would call chaos. So you have that particular aspect as well. And then we have communication patterns, and we can take a look at what is communicated in various modes, for example, through peer groups, through the internet, through Twitter, through Facebook, through the media, through community meetings, television, newspapers, and the like, and take a look at how this all works. What my colleagues and I have found in our research, for example, in genocide cases, there tends to be high cohesion and low flexibility among the perpetrator groups. But it looks that the situation might be in protests that begin to move into a different dimension of cohesion. Perhaps the society itself becomes much lower in cohesion, and also perhaps we see the flexibility change as well to lower. That may be part of the dimension. You may find that particular groups become tighter and more cohesive, and the question is, do they become pathologically cohesive? And you might also find the inability to change. Flexibility becomes very problematic, and groups are unable to make changes. And what we have here are different groups that then interact in a way where change becomes problematic, or lack of change becomes problematic. The final example I'll give, a lot of people talk to me and they talk about the problems of the far right or the problems of the far left. Let's talk about the far, far, far right and the far, far, far left. My response would be both are problematic. The extremes are the problematic features. And so today, when we're looking at protests around the world, I think what you're beginning to see are clashing group values on this circumplex model, where you're having different levels of cohesion and different levels of flexibility within and between groups. And I certainly cannot say with any high degree of certainty exactly where different groups are falling, but I also want to point out that groups also can change on this on these dimensions as well. So what I would hopefully just present from this is that there's different levels of flexibility and cohesion, as well as different communication patterns that are in constant flux and change, and this of course has consequences for what happens in our society. So far I've been terribly distressed by the very, in my opinion, biased presentation in the media about all these protests going around in the United States and the world. I would certainly want to know more about, how diverse are these protests? How cohesive are they? How flexible are they? What types of communication patterns are being used? And I'd also want to know if they're protesting against the banks and Wall Street. I'd want to know, how do we understand Wall Street? Is Wall Street this really tight, pathologically cohesive group with very little flexibility? And so the analyst using the circumplex models focuses on all of the groups and tries to understand the patterns of interactions. And this wraps up our brief exploration of David Olson's and his colleagues' circumplex model.